Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. I'm Paula Stern. I'm happy to be affiliated with the Atlantic Council for quite a long time and was thrilled when I got a request from Matt Burrows to introduce our esteemed guest. And Matt, who will conduct an I know will be a really interesting dialogue. I have tremendous respect for these two gentlemen. Though I just accused Ed Luce of perpetrating a hoax because he said that his wonderful book, in my view, his wonderful book, was a 3-hour read. But I found out that it took me longer, but that's only because he had so many pithy things to say, and they were so beautifully expressed in these pungent terms that I had to keep writing things down and stopping all the time. It's a fabulous book. I recommend all of y'all run out after the discussion and buy yourself one. I had a few little quibbles, particularly the title. It could have been a lot sexier. I mean, you know, so one of my suggestions is the end of the American dream the world's nightmare? Now, because what Ed has done in this very short 200-page book is to describe what is quite a nightmare. Talking about a widening income gap and a deepening gulf between the metropolitan elites and the others outside the cities, and a shrinking middle class and vanishing mobility and the weakening of the engine of growth in the form of our middle class, stagnation. And as he said, the tone of our politics has now shifted from hope to nostalgia. That's the American dream. And another quote of his was, Trump has channeled rage. The blue-collar whites especially yearn for the security of this lost age, that American dream. He talks about growth. Growth is incredibly important here, but we still remain in a mode here, a notion of austerity, that we can do nothing, the government can do nothing. This is, I think, our challenge. Like his kinsman, Keynes, in the 30s, who was calling upon our politicians and who saw how the elites at that time were being discredited because government was not doing what needed to be done to satisfy what were the demands of its people. And in consequence, we had the National Socialists and the Communists in Keynes's period using government action to revive their economies. So we come to today and the great opportunity to dialogue. Matt, briefly, is the director, as you may know, of the Atlantic Council's Foresight, Strategy, and Risks Initiative. And prior to coming to the Atlantic Council, he was the counselor to the National Intelligence Council, where he was responsible for the staff of senior analysts and production technicians who guided and shepherded all the National Intelligence Council's products from inception to dissemination. And Ed, when he's not writing prolifically for at night, I guess, these wonderful books, is the Washington columnist and commentator for the Financial Times. He writes a weekly column, FT's Leaders editorials on American politics and the economy, and other articles. He's worked since the FT since 1995, all over the world, Philippines correspondent, capital markets editor, South Asia bureau chief in New Delhi. and well, the Washington bureau chief between the years '06 and 2011. So I leave this to you. The event is recorded, and I thank everyone for joining in. And I would like our two wonderful speakers to start their dialogue. And again, I thank you very much for this great privilege to introduce you both.
Thanks so much.
Oh, you have that.
So thanks, Ed, for coming. And why don't we just dive in? So one thing that occurred to me, actually in rereading it just a day or two ago, that there seems to be an internal tension between, on the one hand, saying that, as Paul has just talked about, all these things, the decline of the middle class, the economic stagnation, the degradation of the democratic order, all of these things seem to be permanent. And then you also say, well, if 77,000 Midwesterners had voted for Hillary Clinton instead of Donald Trump, we would be in a whole different world.
So thanks for having me, and thank you, Paula, very much for that introduction. This is a somber topic, and if I occasionally grin, it's because my wonderful 10-year-old daughter is doing a video project. So it's a sort of light-hearted angle that I've got here. So it doesn't mean to say I'm taking the topic lightly. The tension between the very deep-seated, I believe, structural economic squeeze on the middle skilled of the Western world and the fact that Hillary could be president. Look, this is counterfactual, but if Hillary were president now, I'm not sure how much better things would be. I think we would have a very sane, strategic-minded, and experienced woman in the White House, so that would clearly be massively different. But would she be making the American political system work? Would she be getting things through a Republican Congress that Obama wasn't able to get through? I very much doubt it. I suspect there would be a Weimar Republic quality to Washington right now if Hillary were president. But, you know, I can't prove that. It's a counterfactual. If a few 100,000 votes had gone the other way in Britain, we wouldn't have Brexit, which is, I think, a less reversible decision than Trump. You can't impeach Brexit. It's very, very difficult to see how Britain's going to retrace its steps on that very fateful decision. The fact that Trump was the nominee of the GOP, the fact that his floor was 42% of the American electorate, that I think is signal enough that's a loud enough alarm bell, I think, to signal to us that things have changed very, very dramatically. So I can see what you mean by that tension, but I don't feel it. And I mean, if you look at France, which is very much the most positive story right now across the West, a very, very positive, where the glass of champagne is more than half full right now. Even there, if you contrast 2002, where Marine Le Pen's father got through to the second round, losing with 18% of the vote, when the Republic sort of came to a halt, communists, socialists, everybody stopped campaigning and just said, we're going to vote for Chirac. This is a crisis of the post-war, of the Fifth Republic. This is a fascist who's reached the second round, and he lost with 18 to 82 with 5 million votes. Marine Le Pen got 11 million in the second round last month. And whilst it's very true and very welcome that Macron looks like he's going to get a legislative majority, remember, this is a party that was created just a year ago. It's not just the Front National that's looks like being demolished, thankfully, in these elections, but the socialists, the Gaullists, the communists, pretty much everybody else. It's an extraordinarily fluid, potentially very positive, but highly disruptive situation that's going on in France.
But, you know, isn't that a good thing? I mean, you know, that the kind of renewal that, you know, looks like is happening, at least in France, is actually what we would be hoping for elsewhere. And I was just wondering, I mean, you wrote a column that was published this morning that said, you know, maybe it's an Anglo-American story. And I was wondering, you know, should the book, and this, should it be entitled something, The Retreat of the Anglo-American Liberalism, or even The Retreat of the Anglo-American World?
I think The Retreat of the Anglo-American World will be a perfectly justifiable title. By the way, Paula, I mean, I had an argument with my publishers. They wanted this to be called The Collapse of Western Liberalism, which isn't that much sexier, but it's stronger. But I won that argument because it's not about the collapse, it's about the retreat, and retreat implies the ability to regroup. So yes, to some degree. I mean, I think that Britain and the United States are the two longest running democracies, and they're the only two that have that emerged from the 20th century without revolution or occupation or any really violent upheaval. They're the most complacent democracies. And I think after the Berlin Wall fell, whilst the whole of the West was very triumphal about the end of the Cold War, quite rightly and understandably so, the Anglo-Saxon wing of the West turned triumphalism into a sort of eternal creed for how you should live and what political model you should aspire to. And that hubris is coming unstuck now. So there is very much an an English-speaking strain here with Britain and America. But the problem extends across the West as a whole. And again, if you look at the rise of far-right and far-left parties in continental Europe, if you look at the parlous condition of Hungary and Poland, if you look at the difficulties that the non-neo-Nazi candidate had in winning the Austrian presidential election just by a whisker, then these weren't problems we were having in the 80s and the 90s. This is a long-term problem, which could be positive too, and the French disruption could be positive. So I don't want to, the world is not going to hell in a handcart. And if we stand back and look at the world as a whole, more people are being lifted out of poverty at a faster rate than ever before in human history. And the Millennium Development Goals were achieved ahead of time. And there's every sign that in sub-Saharan Africa, they're going to start picking up and emulating what we've seen in China and India. So if you look at the world as a whole, the human development indicators, the literacy rates, the under-5 child mortality rates, there's an extraordinarily positive story going on. But the impact of globalization, the impact of automation on the middle of our democracies is a serious crisis. It didn't suddenly mushroom in 2016, and it hasn't suddenly vanished in Macron's victory. And that's I think really the point that we, and particularly our elites, need to understand, because I notice a tendency amongst elites to find one bit of good news and say, okay, crisis over, let's just continue as we are. And that would be wrong, and that would be, I think, to play with fire.
But how do you then solve, I mean, some of these, what seems to me, very deep-seated economic and social problems? Because you talked about, basically the rise of the developing world and the emerging markets, development of a middle class, but you also find the increasing inequality in all societies, including China. And we seem to have, all sorts of kind of forces that are really undergirding that inequality. So it's a social fact. I mean, as we have talked about, it's where you grow up in this country tends to be what income category you're born into tends to be the best predictor of where you're going to end up in terms of of wealth and income.
And that's particularly true of the English-speaking democracies. And it is a great irony of the breast-beatingness we've seen from the United States and Britain since the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, but also under Blair Clinton. In fact, in some ways even more under Blair Clinton, that income mobility is lowest in Britain and the United States amongst all the wealthy countries. You're twice as likely to escape your low-income group if you're Canadian or German than if you're American or British, which are both pretty much at the bottom of the table there. So that's one factor. But rising inequality is okay when all incomes are rising. So India is seeing really sharply rising inequality, but it's seeing sharp average growth too. Mm-hmm. And so it's very different when it's perceived to be a zero-sum game over fixed resources. Which is how we feel, and to some extent is true in low growth, post-2008 America, to a situation where everybody's getting better off. I'll never forget arriving in India to do the FT Bureau Chief job in 2001 and reading a story about, in the Times of India, there were only 3 million cell phone users in India at the time, and it was bemoaning the fact that China was adding that number every month. Well, India's now got approaching 1 billion smartphones. Quite extraordinary. Its life expectancy is 5 years higher today than it was in 2001, in less than 2 decades. Ours is actually going down. And it's a very different picture.
But how, I guess the question for me is how you try to turn that trend around. I mean, you give the French example. You know, in terms on the Gini scale, they're doing much better than we are in terms of lessening inequality. But, you know, socialist government put in a huge wealth tax, something that probably would never be passed in this country or the UK. I mean, and you also have, you know, a much more meritocratic educational system than we do.
Yeah, I mean, it's easier for somebody without resources to get in. Macron, remember, is now, he ran a brilliant campaign where he co-opted Gaullists, he co-opted socialists, and he managed to build this broad electoral coalition very skillfully. As an outsider, insider, he sort of managed to wear both those suits very, very well. But he's now going to embark on Thatcherite labour market reform. I mean, employer sort of blessed. This is tough in any country. It's particularly tough in France. And he's going to have probably a majority of the En Marche party will probably have a majority in the when the second round happens 10 days from now, of mostly people who've never been in public life and been elected to anything before. It's a very thin, broad but very thin coalition. He's going to have to keep that together in governing. He's campaigned in poetry, but the governing in prose is going to be a very, very difficult test. And then, of course, he's going to have to persuade hopefully, well, not hopefully, but a forecast to be re-elected Angela Merkel to rewrite the European fiscal bargain, to end austerity in Europe, to give him the space to push through these kinds of reforms. It could happen, but it's quite a difficult set of challenges. He's got to put it mildly.
Well, coming back to this country, how do you rate Trump? I know you wrote this just when he was coming into office. He's very much the arch villain in your piece. Has he mellowed in your mind since, or has he become even a worse factor?
So I think I handed in the manuscript for this in early February. So this was still, you know, I think of Trump as having gone in 3 phases, or people having viewed Trump as having been in 3 phases. The first being, okay, the Republic's in danger. You know, Mike Flynn's national security advisor, he's trying to ban Muslims. He's, you know, threatening a trade war with China. Then suddenly, you know, the Flynn stuff comes out. Steve Bannon is removed from the NSC. Flynn is fired. Xi Jinping meets Trump in Mar-a-Lago for over the most beautiful chocolate cake ever, and suddenly we're saying, oh no, he's a normal Republican president, and the axis of adults have got him, signed up now to traditional bipartisan foreign policy priorities. And then phase 3, which we're still in, and I don't think we ever really were not in, began when he fired Comey. And suddenly, all kinds of other things started happening, including Trump going out of his way, I think, to poke allies in the eye, to walk back all kinds of pledges he'd made, and of course, most egregiously, to abandon the Paris deal. Rex Tillerson, the axis of adults, so MMT, Mattis, McMaster, Tillerson, as it's called. Rex Tillerson testified on his budget, the state budget request yesterday in Congress, and he said, look, this isn't, he was being questioned very closely. How can you achieve anything in terms of international institutions, your diplomatic goals, with a third lower budget? How can you do this? And he said, well, it's not about budget, it's about people, which is all very well, but where are the people? Who are the people? And then he was pressed, when are we going to see these people? And the answer is at the end of the year, and is at the end of the fiscal year. No, the end of the calendar year. And this is not a serious axis of adults. I wouldn't wish, I wouldn't wish Tillerson's job on anybody, including Tillerson. But the idea that Trump is going to normalize is preposterous. It's just so self-evidently wrong that it hardly needs stressing.
But you have some, institutions that seem to be going after him, correcting his actions. I mean, he can't get through the courts, at least so far, his ban on Muslim immigrants. You have the same case in the UK, where you've had a vote in which Theresa May was entirely humiliated, and now it looks like we're going to go for a softer Brexit. So it's not always the worst case that...
It's a good question. It's two answers, one on Britain, one on America. On America, I think the Madisonian system is working. The checks and balances is in place. I think the system will not fail. And I think, it's not just the courts, it's not just the appointment of Mueller as special counsel, it's not just signs that some Republican figures in the Senate, at least, are going to, exercise the first branch's prerogative to check executive power. I think the system at that level is working. My fear is about the larger system, the political economy of America, because Trump came to office on the back of the forgotten American man and woman, and he is proposing a budget that would, if it got anywhere near to being implemented, dramatically betray the middle-class vote that brought him to power. I don't need to go into the details. Everyone's familiar. So the larger system, I don't think is working, but I do think the Constitution is working, and that's not nothing. Britain, last Thursday night when the vote was happening, I was in Chicago at a conference, hoping for a slightly more hung parliament than it was. I mean, sorry about my vocabulary. It's not that hung. It'll take 10 seats to make up a majority. A soft Brexit. A soft Brexit involves, if indeed Britain is capable of negotiating a soft Brexit with Macron and Merkel and the other 25 countries, would involve Britain paying all the money continually into the budget. But first of all, a huge €100 billion upfront divorce fee. Then regular budget contributions in order to participate in the customs union and hopefully the single market, in exchange for giving up any say over the regulations, over the trade negotiations, over any decisions taken in the European single market. Now, how is that a better situation than the sweet spot, the optimal position Britain had before Brexit, namely that it was a member of the single market, a full influential member, probably the leading trade influence on the European bloc, and not a member of the euro area. Perfect position to be in, which Britain's not going to get back to. So the fact that soft Brexit, which deprives Britain of every bit of sovereignty it thought it was winning back is now the thing that everybody's hoping for. I think is a measure of just what a drastically bad decision was taken last year.
But it would be better than no deal.
It would be better than no deal. Anything would be better than no deal. I mean, you know, flights could stop. I mean, there are all sorts of things that could just stop happening with no deal. So yes, it's better than no deal. The young voted heavily last Thursday. That was a very good sign. I would love it if Britain were Ireland, which twice, you know, had votes against Europe, and twice they went back to the Irish people and said, okay, now we're going to ask you again. Are you listening carefully? And the turnout doubled. Everyone read, oh, this is important. And then they sort of Googled the EU, as the British electorate did after the Brexit vote. I would love it if we had a two-stage presidential election system in the United States. There are all kinds of things I would love. I'd love to be 6'2", but these things are not likely to happen.
So going a little bit farther east, how much of a threat is Russia? You know, you have an anecdote in there. It's about, you know, starting your adult life, going to see the Berlin Wall coming down, and then last December going to Moscow, actually a conference that we were both at, and this is kind of the bookends of your kind of experience so far, and obviously certain ironies and paradoxes in that.
You know, I think Russia is playing a bigger role in our minds because of the Trump campaign that it would otherwise be playing. I think the geopolitical sort of challenge for America is China. It's Russia, though, in the short term, holds a lot of potential nuisance value, and particularly, you know, if there's going to be daylight between the United States and a new Franco-German motor in Europe. I mean, we're getting revived talk of an independent European nuclear deterrent, which would be, I think, unlikely, but it's significant it's being discussed even. So Putin's, as you know, got a bunch of really quite bold demonstrations going on. They arrested Alexei Navalny, the sort of de facto leader of the opposition. He has a presidential election coming up in 2018. And he's a master at reading weak situations that can be exploited. And there are plenty of potential ones there under Trump's Article 5 ambiguity, where he could test Trump. I'm going to be fascinated next month in Hamburg at the G20, when Trump and Putin meet for the first time, to watch the optics of this. And I'm no doubt, Putin being Putin, he will use this to get a read on Trump. How can I push it? Is he a paper tiger, or is he just a reckless, impulsive person? I suspect Putin doesn't know, and we'll get a good FSB-ish shrewd read on Trump next month. So the short-term capacity to disrupt of Russia is, I think, very significant. I think Trump's inability to form any kind of rational foreign policy on Russia because of the lens through which Russia is filtered here domestically is very significant. But the larger game here is how America deals with the rise of China.
Do you think Europe is at all a factor in that?
In the rise of China, or in the Russia?
Well, in U.S.'s relations with Russia. I mean, you know, it occurs to me, you don't talk about it a lot in the book, but, you know, as Anglo-Americans, we sometimes underestimate. We've had a history of underestimating Europe's potential. And you could see with the Franco-German revival, and, you know, Macron has talked a lot about a separate European identity on defense, and of course he did host Putin 2 weeks or so after his election at Versailles, that they want to play an independent policy that is separate from, have their own foreign policy.
So I think Europe's priorities overwhelmingly are going to be inward-looking, about deepening integration and shoring up the coherence of the bloc. And Brexit is kind of accidentally rather helpful
Yeah.
to that goal, because Theresa May has pulled off something really almost nobody has ever pulled off, which is united 27 countries in consensus pretty much instantly without any debate. So that was a pretty big feat, and that's going to prove to be the gift that keeps on giving, I suspect, given the way British politics is going. I think the energies in Europe for the time being are going to be focused on getting this Franco-German model right, the rebooting of the Franco-German engine. And that does require something hugely, hugely important, which is if Merkel wins, she's going to need to sideline, fire, or have a road to Damascus moment with Wolfgang Schäuble, her finance minister, who is the sort of high priest of what I call pseudo-monetarism. I mean, Germany we think of in all non-fiscal senses as a really benign international player, and it is. And Merkel stands tall. But on the fiscal front, it's been playing an utterly destructive, in economic terms, pro-cyclical role, deepening austerity and recessions in the Club Med countries and pushing Europe apart. Macron knows this. How skilled is Macron, will Macron be at enabling and helping Merkel to persuade the Germans to change what is a fundamental part of Germany's political economy, of its national character, to be a leader, if that's what we're talking about? Is Germany going to be a leader in the vacuum being created by an absent United States? It costs money. America knows this. It costs money to be a leader. Will Germany spend? And that's the real. That's why I'm not quite as exuberant about Macron's potential as I could be, because I think it's an incredibly difficult sell he's got to make, and I think that's where the energies in the European debate are going to be sort of centered.
And the last chapter in your book is about a U.S. war with China. So you mentioned about China being the real peer competitor for the U.S. But you also just mentioned Xi Jinping and Trump getting along over chocolate cake and Trump's Florida estate. So are you still thinking that war is likely? Do we stumble into it somehow? Do the Chinese bring it on? What are your views now?
So the Mar-a-Lago meeting was fascinating. I think Xi Jinping played Trump like a violin. Or as Bob Kagan puts it, he brought fruit to the volcano. He turned up at Trump's Florida clubhouse. He provided gifts, trademark approvals, not just for Trump, but for his family. He enjoyed the beautiful chocolate cake that Trump provided him. He completely disarmed Trump, and Trump went from being a xenophobe who's talked about the Chinese raping the American economy to a Sinophile sort of overnight, and then who knew North Korea is complicated. Yeah. Xi Jinping's going to be consecrated another 5 years in power as president in September. The whole Chinese goal this year has been to keep things stable until the politics is fixed in the fall. And I think 2018 is going to be a very interesting year because, like Putin assessing and reading Trump, there is a debate going on in China about whether we can test Trump and how far we can test Trump. We know pretty much as a fact that the South China Sea installations, the Chinese activity in the South China Sea is a fact on the ground. It's de facto Chinese sovereignty, even if it isn't de jure. We also know that to turn that situation around would require war. So is Trump prepared to go to war? I don't think they will think he is prepared to go to war. But I'm sure he's going to be tested in 2018. I think Xi Jinping is stringing him along on North Korea. There's nothing the Chinese are going to do on North Korea that they haven't already done. Very modest steps to show they're part of the international conversation, but they're not going to risk pulling the plug, and they're certainly not going to risk, Kim Jong-un going sort of AWOL. So I think I certainly don't predict a war. This was a scenario I thought that would concentrate minds that I put in the book, and this was over an accidental 2001 situation where we had with the Bush administration early on, and it was how Trump would react to that, and we don't really know, and that's what's so worrying. When I sit here, I'm as concerned as anybody about funding for Planned Parenthood. I believe Planned Parenthood's goals are worthy, but that's not what really worries me. What worries me about Trump is that he's very unpredictable and he's unstable, and that America, by and large, has been a source of global stability. Now, I know there are very egregious exceptions to that, very egregious exceptions, but if you'll bear with me for 1 second, under Trump, America is becoming an exporter of instability, uncertainty, vacuums, and all kinds of tensions that I don't know when an event happens, when it's the sort of whites of his eyeballs situation room moment, whether I would feel anything other than terrified that it's Trump there and not another character.
But there are Chinese and there's certainly Russians who believe that Hillary Clinton would have triggered a war, either with Russia or China, because she was obviously one who was very hard on China, led the charge on the pivot, which was seen in China as containment. Would the war, what's your reasoning that Trump, because he's unpredictable, that's going to lead to more of a...
So how does Trump talk? I'll get to Hillary in 2 seconds, but how does Trump talk about the world? When MMT haven't just sort of held him down, strapped him down and said, you must think this and say this, with the Romanian prime minister or whatever, what he consistently says is, they're ripping us off, they're laughing at us, they're taking us for a ride, they're playing us for suckers. And he means allies as well as trading partners. Trump's, and this isn't, a recent sort of thing, Trump's view of the world is a really Hobbesian, brutish, elemental view of what foreign policy means. It's not realism. It's brutalism. And I think that's been his consistently held view now for pretty much 30, 40 years. So this is his default. He turned 71 today. He's not going to change.
Although he changes when he meets them.
Yeah, he changes when he meets them. I mean, he said the right things to Merkel the first time in public. They matter, but the wrong things the next time. I mean, so, it's great. He sometimes says the right things, but they're like the sort of Snapchat things. You send photos like, oh, that picture just disappeared. You can't trust. You can no longer rely on the American president to the word of the American president and the alliance with America whilst this president is president. Hillary, you're absolutely right. She was a robust, hawkish American exceptionalist, sort of in the Truman mold, perhaps. Certainly different from Obama. I think she would be more aggressively testing Chinese activity in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. I think she would be pushing more aggressively against Putin. And we can argue whether America should do that or shouldn't do that, but what I would just say about the personality is that she's predictable. You understand the principles there, whether you agree with them or not, and you understand that she's got quite a lot of experience and knowledge of the world and has advisors who she would listen to. And that to me is it's just a whole different ballgame. There's a separate debate to be had about how America deals with its relative decline and the rise of others and the challenge of China. That's a really good debate to have. But just in terms of the psychology of the president, they're night and day.
I'm going to open it up because I want to allow some time for questions from the floor. I think there's a two-finger there. If you want to introduce yourself just briefly and say
My name
your
is Walter
affiliation.
Jurasek. I don't understand the liberalism from your side. The media is constantly bashing Donald Trump. However, they don't say nothing about, and the liberal approach to the Trump is totally wrong. They never say any positive things about Trump. That's one of the things. Can you show me in this world, anywhere in the world, which country, socialist, run by liberals, is doing very well in economically, morally, physically, and where is the personal responsibility? God bless the United States of America, because why? Individual responsibility, individual rights, and the law makes America great from the beginning. The Western European Union, which I just come back last week from Portugal, Spain, Denmark, Poland, is incredible what happened to them. I talk to the older people, I talk to the younger people. I'm not a journalist, but I always want to investigate how people live. The elite lives very well. The elite want to dictate. What do you think about the Western liberalism?
Oh, that's a big question. Western liberalism in general, I'm in favor of it. I'm in favor of the various sort of different forms it's taken. I think there are strengths and weaknesses to the American model. I think there are strengths and weaknesses to how Germany approaches them, have very different histories and very different constitutions. But it's what, and Britain of course has its own version, but it's what we share in terms of values about individual rights, individual equality before the law as opposed to group justice, about freedom of expression, and about electing governments and holding them to account and throwing them out. I don't think we have a better system than representative democracy. I have a deep suspicion of plebiscitary democracy, even before Brexit, and California ballot initiatives. So I don't have anything much more insightful to say. I don't have a better political system if we're talking in the abstract about political systems.
How about some gentleman over here?
Hi, thanks for coming. My name is Philip Cornell. I'm a senior fellow here at the Global Energy Center. You'd mentioned the hubris that came out of the sort of Thatcher-Reagan revolutions. And I mean, in both of those cases, it seems like you had pretty sensible right-wing business, pro-business policies that were turned populist on purpose by the establishment. And that obviously came back to sort of bite them. And part of making that populism happen is kind of to very much simplify an economic theory into what's essentially a sort of, religious reincantation of some kind of economic theory, which never works, right? Whether it's on the left or the right. And it eventually sows the seeds of its own destruction, which we eventually saw. And politically, it came to the same point. But at every time in history where we've seen this kind of massive, returns to capital outstripping returns to labor, there's been a policy response. I mean, trade unionism came out of industrialization. The Keynesianism and FDR came out of the collapse of the end of the 20s. And so my question would just be today, how can we see, especially in a place like America, because I think it's different than in Europe. I mean, part of that populism is also, and making it simple was also, and I know you don't like identity politics, but also to really racialize things like welfare, right? Welfare queens and all this kind of thing. So even if you have a working class which is getting decimated by extreme neoliberal economic policies under Trump, as you mentioned, a government response is less easy to mobilize politically because there's this animus and this sort of political idea that government help or redistribution of wealth through the state is somehow, is somehow political at the same time. Anyway, so just how would you imagine that happening in some place like the US? And what would you see a redistributive left look like if it emerged?
I think that the distribution of tax dollars could be done a lot better. I mean, the first thing I would do would, if I were economic dictator for a day, would be to abolish the mortgage subsidies and the various supports, which grossly regressive. And the bigger your McMansion, the larger the taxpayer subsidy. That would be an example. It's not the solutions that we're lacking. it's a politics that's anywhere near to implementing them. So I don't think we lack ideas about what to do about this. I mean, I tend to use shorthand. We do need a Marshall Plan for the middle class. And we need an incredibly concerted employer, with employer input, worker retraining, lifetime retraining, curriculum upgrading, investment in education from early years through your working life. And other countries, to some degree, less or greater degree, are able to do this. We need a new deal for the gig economy. We need to update how we help people when they hit economic rainy days. We need a completely different budget process. These things would have a huge impact on what we've been talking about, on the fate and the health and the outlook of the middle class. What we're lacking is any conceivable situation right now where the politics is going to produce this. And I'm not talking here about redistribution of a fixed pie. These would be tremendous growth-boosting investments, very much in line with American history, not just FDR, but many other American, Lincoln, Eisenhower. You're asking me to imagine how we get to a situation, the Democratic nominee in 2020, is it going to be a Macron or is it going to be a Jeremy Corbyn? Because right now that seems to be the debate in the Democratic Party. And I just don't know. I mean, I predict some things because they're trends rather than events. But this is 3 years out, and there's a very, very heated debate going on in the Democratic Party, and it's clear if there is something in common there with Macron's voters and Labour Party's voters last Thursday, it's the young will come out for the populist left. I'm not sure the populist left is really the answer, but it might well be the electoral answer in 2020.
Yes.
Hi.
I think it's off, but I can speak louder. I'm Andrea Mook. I'm the Deputy Director of the Latin America Center here at the Council, and a fan. I used to be a journalist, and I seriously want to hear it.
You're a recovering journalist.
So one of the things that we discuss a lot in my center is looking ahead to 2030 or 2050. What are we going to do with this idle mass of workers that are probably going to grow if things stay as they are, if the systems stay as they are. And the countries are very worried about how they're going to deal with this tension with the middle class and with the lower classes, considering automation, artificial intelligence, and everything that's coming out. So there's a number of people that even question whether retraining and education will be enough in this new world that we're coming to, or if that's why ideas like universal income have come about, right? So I just wanted to ask your opinion about that.
It's a good question. So this debate of a universal basic income that everybody gets, say $15,000 a year, and all other forms of welfare are abolished, has superficial attractions, and I understand why it's not just the left that are interested in this, but the libertarians too, because you get rid of bureaucracy. You get rid of the need to decide who qualifies and who doesn't qualify. Everyone's just getting $15,000 a year. And so I can see the meretricious attraction of that model, but the maths don't really add up. Firstly, if you look at the fiscal, if you look at the tax increases that will be required, it's a grossly inefficient way of spending public money. And I think most importantly is that unemployment or declining labor force participation, the fact that there are more American prime-aged males out of work than there are French, which is, I think, a part of the story. Yeah. That is not just an economic or an income crisis, it's a crisis of morale. It's a crisis of self-respect, of dignity, and of people's feeling that they're not wanted, that they're not contributing to the society. And UBI doesn't solve that. UBI doesn't solve the fact that, after 6 months of not working, your chances of divorcing, committing suicide, becoming an opioid addict, getting onto disability benefit and getting these prescriptions, go up exponentially after 6 months. It's not that the income changes after 6 months. It's that your intrinsic self-respect as a person begins to atrophy quite quickly. And the UBI just doesn't address that. So I can see why it sounds like a sort of utopian solution to a world where robots are doing all the work. But I don't think it's a human solution to because this is very much a human challenge we're facing at the moment, as well as an economic one.
So, woman.
Thank you. My name is Guadalupe. My question is just regarding about how we elected the new president there. In my opinion, I am very happy that Donald Trump got the election. Why? Hillary Clinton, as a Secretary of State, got so much money collecting from other countries, even for countries who are against the women. So can you imagine if she were elected as a president, her foundation can be overflow of money. And also, she was not accountable with the emails. 53,000 emails were loosened all over. So how I can explain the person be elected when she is over the law? I don't agree with that. So.
Look, if she'd been elected president, the foundation would be a massive problem. Now, the fact that there was at one stage during the campaign talk of Chelsea running it. Now, maybe it would have been in a blind trust situation like Donald Trump's children have, but it would have been an ongoing, running, massive conflict of interest. And we'd have all kinds of legal challenges now to that. I mean, I suspect she might have been forced to completely shut it down, to confront her husband and say, look, it's done really well, but let's shut this down. Who knows? I don't accept, though, the implicit sort of equivalence between that and what's happening with the first family now. And these trademark application approvals in China, to just be one example, Trump Hotel down the road, the fact that every Gulf country holds every single bash that it does in Washington at that hotel. These are minor examples, of course. This is a pretty extraordinary and unprecedented situation, but it's a matter of degree. And the big picture here is that dynasty in American politics is becoming frighteningly normal. And, we've elected King Donald as opposed to Queen Hillary. But it's becoming frighteningly normal. And it reflects, I think, in a way, the reproduction of the elites through hereditary meritocracy that I think is the source of so much rage from what we call the left behinds in Britain, or the squeezed middle. So, I don't think I think it's false equivalence to put Hillary and Trump on the same level, really, I do. And I don't think the emails really amount to much. But the Clinton Foundation would be a massive story, and people in my profession would be rightly digging into it right now if she were president.
And at the back. And why don't we take a couple of questions, the remaining ones, just because we're running out of time. I know you want to leave some time for book signing out there. There are a whole bunch of...
I have a video interview with my daughter, too.
Yeah. So,
thank you.
Make your question short.
Yeah. My name is Javier Sancho.
Hi, Javier.
I think your intervention was too short. I guess I have to read the book now. It was very interesting. I was struck by your reference to war, which is a very important concept, and the fact, also your reference to the European increasing desire to build a defense identity, and also the fact that technically, maybe with the exception of the years of the Great Depression, the U.S. has been at war. So the question is not whether there will be a war. The question is whether this war will happen in the Middle East, something that will keep Saudis and Israelis happy at the same time, something that will not prompt Chinese and Russian intervention. So my question is about, do you think, because you mentioned a scenario of war, do you think that there is a possibility of a war of a holy nature, if possible, in that part of the world, reading what happened recently in the region, which is, I mean, they're sending very clear signals now. Do you think that it is possible that we will be coping with a conflict of a different nature in the Middle East in the near future?
So when you say war, you mean an American involvement with American boots on the ground in the Middle East? Yeah, we've got them in Iraq, we've got them in Syria, we've got them in Yemen, we've got special forces all over. And you're talking on a sort of conventional war scale with Iran. It's quite possible. It's quite conceivable. I mean, I think one clear important thing to understand about Trump is that he does want to undo whatever Obama did, rightly or wrongly. And the Iran deal, I mean, we've got Paris and Obamacare very clearly being undone, but the Iran deal is a pretty egregious Obama legacy. And the MMT, they kind of agree with him on this. I mean, Mattis is quite hawkish on Iran. So I would never underestimate the ability of Trump to stumble into a conflict with Iran. Oddly, I'm slightly more nowadays trustworthy after the extraordinary re-election of Rouhani, of Iran's sense of restraint in this situation. But the fact that the day after Rouhani was re-elected, the person we want, the moderate, the pragmatist, the one who does deals, the one who the Ayatollahs do not want, the fact that Tillerson could stand side by side with his Saudi counterpart and Trump with King Salman and call on Iran to improve its freedom of expression from Saudi Arabia, for goodness sake, a country, does not give me much confidence that these people are competent enough to avoid war, let alone deliberately plan one, because this is Keystone Cops.
Okay, we got some final questions, so I'm going to take three together. Did you still have a question? And then I'll go to you, and then two in the back. So 4 questions, very short questions.
Robert Gelbart, I'm on the board of the Atlantic Council and longtime State Department. Comparing the hypotheticals on China and Russia, I think there are significant differences, and I think I disagree with you. I don't disagree about the issue of the idea of the Chinese daring the United States on the South China Sea and having spent a significant amount of time in Southeast Asia. See it. You didn't mention Taiwan, and that is the place where I do worry that there might be a serious confrontation if China ever decided to create something serious. But with Russia, I do think it's more serious, potentially. Perhaps not in the next couple of years, but over the medium term, in a country where adult male mortality is increasing dramatically, worker productivity is sinking dramatically, elements of the economy are disappearing. I mean, oil, gas, mineral production, of course, prices are way down, and the only kind of serious exports they have right now are in weapons. The only high-tech sector that's working in Russia is hackers. I worry more about the possibilities there for instability in, say, 5 years. And we have essentially a country of teenagers with nukes, which is a very, very worrisome possibility, I think. Meanwhile, in China, the leadership is contending more with a population, a growing middle class, and the need to keep that middle class happy. So I think you may be underestimating the possibility for volatility in Russia.
Hold the answer. We got.
Hi, I'm Vikrant Reddy. I'm an attorney here in town. You called your book "The Crisis of Western."
The Retreat.
The Retreat, excuse me, The Retreat. But I wonder if you think that there is a comparable retreat in the East, because there does seem to be a nativist streak in India and the Philippines and Japan and other places. I'd love your comments.
And there were, I think, 2 other hands up.
Hi, Stephen Wallace. I recently retired from the Pentagon. I'd just like to ask you a question about the nature, or at least the perception, of the international order or system, and whether we're moving from a multilateral to a multipolar order, and the consequence of that being, are we going to see a world that will be characterized by a mix of confrontation and accommodation on different values and goals, rather than a system we had under multilateralism where we were cooperating on common goals?
Was there another hand up? Was that it? Yeah, I'll pass. Okay, so 3 questions.
Okay, just because
Russia, China.
yours was more a comment, and so I'll respond to it in a second by saying you know more about me, Russia, than me. But I've got 1 or 2 other things. I'll just pick up on the Philippines, India. Yes, I mean I was based in the Philippines. In fact, for the FT, it was my first job, 95, 96. And I, in fact, went down to the city of Davao because I'd read in the tabloids about this sort of Charles Bronson kind of mayor they had there, a man named Rodrigo Duterte, and he took me to a shooting range with his goons and tried to get me to shoot at a target, and I missed so badly, and they were in hysterics over this. And I mentioned this in the book. I then asked him, how do you keep crime so low? And he said, our criminals like to fly. So we take them up in the helicopter and help them fly. And I wrote this, it's all quoted in my FT article from then. So this was like Scarface. This is Al Pacino. And now the guy's president. And yet the Philippine middle class are doing very well. Their incomes are rising. So your question is a very good one. And I think, the thing that I don't get into as much in this book, and that I've yet to see anybody grapple with in a really serious sense, is the impact of technology on politics, and in particular the impact of social media on the gatekeepers, whether those gatekeepers are in traditional journalism or party managers, people who tend to filter out the lunatic options, the Walter Cronkite kind of figures. And I don't know the answer to that. I think that it's something that challenges all kinds of political system, whether they're democracies or China. I think all kinds of political systems are challenged by the technological impact on how we communicate and how quickly governments of any stripe are expected to react, and how difficult it is to react at that warp speed. So, we're grappling with this. It's a very good question. On Russia, I can see that dystopian situation, which you sketch very well. And I think a wounded Putin, or a threatened Putin with low oil prices, and little other economic prospects, and unrest, particularly amongst the urban young, is a very, very vulnerable sort of next 18 months we're going to see. And I don't think he has any love for Donald Trump or loyalty or deal there. I think he will exploit Trump to the extent he can, which I think is probably a very great extent. So you might well be right. In the short term, Russia is a greater problem. And finally, your question was a really, really good question. I've temporarily forgotten what it was.
The multilateral,
it seemed good at the time. Yeah, multilateralism versus multipolarity. So the question is, if Trump only lasts 4 years, what's happening? And there is no cataclysm. There is no, my war situation, my war scenario in the book is in fact Taiwan. So I agree with you on that. That's a great vulnerability. The question is, what happens if there's no cataclysm under Trump? We just get the last 150 days times 10. Do we then go back to the status quo ante, even assuming the American people suddenly acquire a new bipartisan desire to do what wasn't really happening under Obama or Bush, which is be the Hercules that upholds the global order? I think that takes quite a leap of imagination. So even without Trump, this was happening. If you remember David Cameron, way before Brexit, rolling out the red carpet for China, rushing to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, adopting mercantilism as opposed to values as the central plank, or one of the central planks of British foreign policy, and many other examples. Now, last week, my former colleague, Chrystia Freeland, Canada's foreign minister and trade minister for NAFTA, gave a really quite brassy speech to the Parliament in Ottawa, saying, well, look, you've done really well by us, America, thank you. You've been just a rock, and now you're not. And so we're going to kind of go it alone to the extent that we can. We hope you come back, but we're going to act as if you're not coming back. And now, again, just sort of multiply that across, think of Qatar, a host to 11,000 American troops, an American military base, in which Trump is now, essentially Qatar has had everything up to act of war declared on it. If you criticize the Saudi decision to cut and sever all links with Qatar, you face 5 years imprisonment in Saudi Arabia. So this is an extraordinary act of hostility up to just short of war that Qatar's neighbors, and I would say highly hypocritical neighbors, have declared on it. What is Singapore going to think about this? What are other American military bases going to think about how Trump has reacted to this? What's Djibouti going to think about this? What's Bahrain going to think about this? They're all going to be hedging because America's not there. America's not there. And the question to me, to get back to your original multipolarity versus multilateralism, is can we set the clock back in 2021, January 20, as if Trump never happened? And I'm skeptical on that. I'm very skeptical about what's going to happen to the liberal international order in that period of time. I've got to think of a really upbeat, positive note on which to end.
Yeah, I know. You got us in the dumps.
Yeah. Yeah,
but it's great having
you. I'll think of it.
Well, it's great having you here, and it's been a great discussion, and hope you can come back.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very good. And there's stacks of books out there, so please go out there.